looked at by our descendants, like a Dead Sea Scroll in 1,000 years' time, what would you think it's worth telling that generation?
Mind spins in spirals like the cogito. I think, therefore, but do I even know? Hume said the sun might not rise in the morning. Patterns ain't proof, just habits we adorn. Russell's teapot floating out in the void. Invisible doubts that can't be destroyed. Belief ain't a bird and the skeptic employs. Question the noise, the cosmos ploys. Skeptic's eyes always peeping the fraud. Truth ain't handed down, it's wrestled from the gods. Doubts my temple, my faith is flawed. Think it through twice before I applaud. Induction wobbles like a table with no leg. Hume's knife cuts leave certainty begging. A billion white swans, burn black renegade. Shatter the mirror, the cracks cascade. Cogito feels strong, but is it really? Thoughts build castles, clouds act silly. Russell's pot spins in the ether so freely. Prove it exists or the claim's too dreamy. Am I the dreamer or the dream in the show? The car wrestled devils, still didn't know. Faith and senses, they play tricks on a low. Truth's a mirage in a desert of woe.
When you are studying any matter or considering any philosophy, ask yourself only what are the facts and what is the truth that the facts bear out. Never let yourself be diverted either by what you wish to believe or by what you think could have beneficent social effects if it were believed. But look only and solely at what are the facts.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Skeptic Philosophy. As always, I am your host, Robert. Today, we have a special guest with us that probably needs no introduction, but he's going to get one anyway. Today, we have a gentleman that wrestles apologetics into headlocks, pokes holes in presuppositionalism, and doesn't believe apples are real for some weird reason. The one and only Curt the Hurt. Curt, how's it going, man?
I mean, I like that. I'm an Apple anti-realist.
Yes.
I also think that about the iPhone. So, like, it's
fair enough.
All the way across.
Yeah, I just thought that'd be a funny little one.
That's good.
Yeah, thanks for coming on again, man. I always enjoy our conversations. I think you might be up to. I think you might have the most time on screen with me presently of anyone that I've had on the show, which is great. I've enjoyed it all. Today we're talking about Mark. You want to say a few opening things, or you want me to go ahead and put the your documents on screen?
I mean, I suppose before we begin, I just need to explain the word paideia. The paideia was the Koine Greek term for an educational program, and there was the standard paideia, which ends up being sort of the scholastic quadrivium and the trivium, but originally it would have just been learning how to write in Greek, and it would have been learning how to write from Homer and from works like Herodotus, Plato and Aristotle. And you would learn the vocabulary, and you would learn how to write the words, and you would learn how to write the letters all at the same time, just so everybody understands what that is. But we can go ahead and start the slides now.
Excellent. Let me bring everyone to the stage here.
Does that look okay?
Looks fine to me, and I can make it a little bigger if it needs to be.
And then
I think it looks very fine to me.
When I move the slides, let me just make sure I can. Yeah, does that work okay?
Looks great.
All right. So the slide is a little bit misleading. I'm not certain about that 85 AD, but that's like a number I'll go ahead and stick with for now. And what we need
is that where your date?
It's a perfectly reasonable date. I think there's a fairly wide latitude, and for my purposes, for what I'm talking about here, 85 works fine.
Okay.
But what is generally accepted in biblical studies, and again, there are lots of multiple different ways you can interpret the timeline. But what's generally accepted in biblical studies is that Paul writes before Mark. And the reason is because when we read Paul, we don't really see the story that Mark tells in the epistles of Paul. And therefore, we just don't have good certainty that he has contact with the story as it's written in Mark. And this is like a fairly standard historical interpretation. People like Burton Mack or Theodore Whedon or Willie Markson or Rudolf Bultmann, they all agree with that general timeline. And that's all I really need to establish here for this understanding. And then we also need to understand that the vast majority of the people who are being recruited for Christianity at this time would not have familiarity with the Hebrew scriptures if they were primarily Greek speakers, right? There was a subset of people who are called God-fearers who would already attend Jewish synagogues and may have some familiarity with the Hebrew scriptures as the Greek Septuagint. But when we read second century apologists like Justin Martyr and like Athenagoras and Aristides and Tatian, what they generally are people who studied Greek philosophy, and then they came into contact with the Hebrew scriptures and became familiar with them as adults, right? And so somebody who's just joining this group and has been exposed to the ideas of Pauline theology, whether they've read the epistles or not, might need instruction into how to understand the corpus of the work that they're being exposed to in Christianity. So what I'm seeing is that Mark can be understood as an initiation text for people who are trying to understand the ideas behind this new understanding of the Hebrew scriptures. And we're going to call that Christianity, but we don't know with certainty that it was called Christianity at the time that Mark was written. That's like not well established.
Yeah, I think there's good reason to think that it wasn't yet. I mean, all the addressing of Paul's confirmed letters, from Romans to all of them, we keep getting these different titles that he's addressing the churches with. He's constantly moving the titles.
And the one term that we do have some reason to think is the earliest term was the way, or the hodos. So that's something just to keep in mind. All right, so going to the next slide. So from my position, Mark is a Pauline Isaiah text that gets people to understand the concepts in the suffering servant narrative of Isaiah and the book of Isaiah as a whole, as they relate to the ideas in Pauline theology. And then it's put in a narrative form because this was the way people were taught ideas in like first and second century the Greco-Roman world. Mark already establishes that there's this Ptolemaic cosmos, right? And we can either assume the Babylonian 3 heavens or the Ptolemaic 7 heavens. But we know that Paul believes in layered heavens because he references it in Corinthians going up to the third heaven. So this has absolutely got to be the way that it's understood. And we have a text called the vision of Isaiah. And in the vision of Isaiah, we see a Christ figure who is named the Beloved, who's ascending and descending through these heavenly layers. And the mechanism whereby he ascends and descends is he changes clothes at each level. Every level he goes, he changes his clothing. Now, there's also and I don't know if my slides are going to mention this later, but there's a text in the Hebrew scriptures in in Zechariah 3, where there is a Satan who goes against a figure named Joshua, which in the Septuagint, the name of Joshua is Iesus. So it would have been marked as Jesus to Greek speakers. And the Jesus has to change out from his dirty rags into a heavenly garment. So there would have been outside of Isaiah some Hebrew scriptural precedent for this idea of the vision of Isaiah. And in Isaiah in chapter 5, the suffering servant is referred to as the beloved of God. And that in Greek is
hold on. I want to make sure Kurt, can I just check with you right quick? Because I thought the suffering servant was primarily a narrative in 53.
It is. It is.
Okay.
So this is
So
the
you're
first
seeing
Isaiah.
some narrative before? Okay.
Well, Israel is referred to as the beloved of God
Mhm.
in the early part of Isaiah, in first Isaiah. And
gotcha.
so the concept that Israel would be God's beloved isn't just present in Isaiah. That's a general idea throughout the Hebrew scriptures that
for sure.
Jacob I have loved and that sort of thing. But the specific phrase ho agapetos in the Septuagint is found specifically in Isaiah chapter 5. So what we're going to say is that this gospel teaches people about the narrative of the suffering servant in the context of Pauline theology. And what I'm going to say is that the character of Bartimaeus, specifically in the Gospel of Mark, is a character who goes through this sequence. Now, my personal opinion, I am not a biblical scholar, nor an expert in Greek, nor an expert in literary theory. I'm just a guy who enjoys reading about this stuff and wasted a bunch of his life on it. So I've thought about it a lot. But I think that the character of Bartimaeus and the youths in both Gethsemane and in the tomb are the same figure. In other words, I think Mark is a very careful writer. When Mark talks about the fig tree in the first scene before he goes to the temple, and then he comes to a fig tree in the second scene after he goes to the temple, he doesn't specifically state this is the exact same tree, but we just have to assume that he's talking about the same tree. Yeah. So I just think he's the kind of author who, if he brings a gun onto the table, he's going to make sure it gets fired by the end of the second act. Right. I don't see anything about the youths that marks them any other way. And the Bartimaeus scene does end in a specific way that we'll talk about. So moving on to the next slide. Sorry, I'm probably running slow. So we need to understand in the first century, you'd only have a descending revealer in the concept of a cosmos where there's a God at the outer edge. This is sort of Aristotle's idea of the unmoved mover. And this idea of Aristotle would be that matter was just too stupid and useless and full of failure to ever interact with the actual unmoved mover. You'd need an intermediary, right? And the intermediary idea is already found heavily throughout both the Hebrew scriptures and certainly first century Greek writings about the Hebrew scriptures. Philo of Alexandria talks all the time about this logos figure. And what we can see is that Philo's description of the logos figure is very similar to Paul's idea of the Christ figure. Paul never uses logos to describe the Christ. John does, but Paul doesn't. Yep. But the words that John and Philo use about the logos figure are very similar to the words Paul uses about his Christ figure. So a descending revealer who comes down from the heavens to explain about the nature of the universe is a very common idea in the first century. If you read Plutarch or other writers in this time, this is a common idea. And Paul describes it as a mystery hidden from people through the ages, which is the kind of thing that these mystery religions and apocalyptic and visionary traditions described. And so we just need to see Mark living in this universe prior to trying to figure out what he's doing as the text. And then one final thing that I want to be clear. Mark is the first gospel. He's the first one writing this. So anything that happens after Mark is written is based on Mark. So if somebody today were to take all the Iron Man comics and movies and write a biography of Iron Man, they absolutely could do it, and they absolutely could use genre markers, and they could make it look exactly like a standard 21st century biography. But we wouldn't ever think that that biography was the primary source of the story if we had the other texts, right? So when we're reading Luke, or we're reading Mark, or we're reading Matthew and we're reading John, what we have to understand is that they're drawing on an already extant tradition. Mark is the only one we know of who's not drawing on an extant written tradition. He's the one who's constructing this narrative the first time. So the genre of Mark is much, much more important than the genre of any other text of this tradition, because it tells us what the original story was crafted for. And if that genre is not a straight historical biography, then it doesn't matter that people later try to construct a straight historical biography using that story as its basis. All right.
Are you going to get to more of the development of, I just because this would be a great place to insert it if you're not going to, about like how Mark gets introduced first in the scriptures timeline wise, and then who the early church kind of puts Mark as and how they associate him with writing?
I don't have a whole lot of time to get too into that, but what I would say to that is, it's very interesting that in all our extant copies of like the combination Bible of the earliest Christians, but these are very late copies, right? We're talking about 4th century stuff. Matthew's first. Matthew comes first. Matthew is writing the big long and all the sort of texts that we have try to argue for Matthean priority. When scholars examine these today, they don't come to the conclusion of Matthean priority. They come to the conclusion of Markan priority. But it does seem like, at least by the 3rd century, there's a strong desire to not give people the idea that Mark was written first. And in fact,
even Eusebius leaned, there you go.
He tries to make up a fake story about Mark being the memoirs of Peter, which, just to be clear, if you have read Mark, Peter does not come across well in the Gospel of Mark. His last action is to deny Jesus 3 times, and that is the last time you see him on screen, so to speak. Now, there's the chapter 14, verse 28, chapter 16, verse 7, sort of dual verse callback to Galilee, but many authors see this as a later insertion, including Willie Markson. And if that's the case, then Peter is just completely unredeemed at the end of the Gospel of Mark.
At the end of Mark, Let me just give a little caveat there. When Eusebius does this, he is proposing that he's reading from or quoting from an earlier text that we don't have any copies of it, but it's Papias of... I forget his damn name. I'm trying to think of the name of the city. Papaya. I can't remember the name of it, but he's citing from this, which we do think is a real book, because other people have cited from it. But
Irenaeus,
copies.
Irenaeus is our source for Papias existing separate from Eusebius. And Irenaeus says he wrote 5 books. He doesn't give us really much about the content of those books. But he does quote Papias's 4th book as saying something about there'll be like this wonderful heavenly existence on earth after Christ returns, where all crops will grow really well and people will live one of these wonderful lives in the new divine order. But that's about all we have that comes separate from Eusebius. And I would argue that we can't count on Eusebius.
No, I agree. We can't count on him. But to hear Eusebius talk, he's citing it as if this information that it was being attributed to Mark as a follower of Peter, he cites it as coming from the Papias.
Correct. Right. But he also says that Matthew was originally written in Hebrew, which we know
fair enough,
correct, right? And he also completely says everything Papias says is a bunch of crap and he's an idiot. So it's just really hard to put too much weight on anything Eusebius is saying about him. So in this Ptolemaic cosmos, we have the earth at the center. There's these heavenly layers as you go outward. Many people identified the visible planets with these individual layers, and the highest divine realm is beyond the visible heaven. And you have these rulers and powers in each layer of this Ptolemaic cosmos. So what we see is that this is the Book of Enoch's cosmos as well, right? And we know the Book of Enoch is a major source text for the understanding of the world of these early Christians. It's mentioned in the Epistle of Jude, but I would say it's mentioned a lot more than that, in the sense that the plan of salvation that most Christians understand, that Satan was the serpent in Eden, and that like God has to save people from the clutches of the satanic, like demonic forces. That's all Enochic. It may not be like specifically written out, but the interpretation of Lucifer falling from heaven and taking a third of the angels, all that stuff, none of that's found directly in either the New Testament or the Hebrew scriptures. Most of it's inferred on an understanding from the book of Enoch. So,
not even
Enoch
Lucifer comes from Enoch, though. He had a different name totally. And then there's just a correspondence of the two that they're compiled together.
Yep. There's a lot of storytelling that like modern Christians are getting from John Milton. They're not even getting it from any other source, but that Milton is drawing from these earlier texts. And these are these multiple heavens. Each heaven has its own like secret truths that you learn if you go up. And earthly events mirror these cosmic realities. That's sort of a Zoroastrian idea, but it's also present in Egyptian cosmology. And again, Egyptian cosmology, like the whole point of the Book of the Dead, the whole point of these like funerary rites in Egypt is to give people the tools they're going to need to get through the 7 layers of heaven and get up to the top layer. The texts would actually describe the little keys that the people are supposed to have and the names of the gods and that sort of thing. So in this cosmology, like you learn secrets about the universe by joining these groups, and you couldn't tell the whole truth. You could get truth from dreams. The gods would tell you what they think by casting lots. Like the book of Jonah has God identifying Jonah as the problem by the sailors casting lots. They cast lots to pick Matthias to take the place of Judas. Like this is the thought world of the people who are writing these texts. So,
well, secrets was big in Mark too. Also, Mark talks about secrets regularly. Even when Jesus speaks to the disciples, he speaks to the disciples directly, but he tells the crowd things in parables that he explains to his apostles in secret. So this is a lot. Mark is a lot of the basis of the Gnostics, I think, to start with.
Absolutely. And again, I think I have a slide on this later, but chapter 4 of Mark is a huge genre marker to me, right? And I'm not alone there. John Dominic Crossan has written an entire book where he says, look, we just need to look at the Gospels as parables. They're extended, lengthy parables. And John Dominic Crossan is somebody who like is a fairly standard like believer in the apocalyptic prophet theory of Jesus, but he's saying like upfront, no, these documents are not standard bioi. They are parables. So, and Isaiah is the deep matrix here, right? Literally, you can watch all these call-in shows with Justin or anybody who is taking calls from Christians, and they'll always say, well, how do you know Jesus is the Messiah? And they'll always go back to Isaiah 53 or some prophecy in Isaiah. It's always going to be Isaiah. Why? Sure. Because Isaiah, like you read it and you're like, oh yeah, I see where they got this. I see where they got this. Now, the problem with that, of course, to me is, yeah, Mark read Isaiah. Mark like describes reading Isaiah. Mark quotes Isaiah. So if Mark is reading Isaiah, the fact that Jesus meets the criteria for maybe what some person in the first century might think is the Messiah criteria written in Isaiah doesn't mean anything, right? It's like saying, well, Rogue One is completely consistent with the earlier Star Wars trilogy.
Yeah,
sure it is. Sure it is. He could read it, and he.
You're cutting out a little bit on this. Anyone else having problems here in Curt here? While we can't hear Curt here, please let me know if you're already having problems here in Curt. I think he's cut out for me completely. I can't make out anything. If you're hearing me, I'm sorry for the technical difficulties. Bear with us one moment. Okay. Yeah, I think it's on Curt's side. Yep, looks like it. Well, I'll pull that down for a moment then. Yeah, Kurt's going to be right back. I'm sure he'll just reconnect when he gets his connection issue. I'll cover a few things on the subject of Mark that I thought was interesting while we wait on Kurt to rejoin here. But I think I'm going to have to close his window to make sure that he's allowed to come back in. Kurt got web. Cluck, cluck. Okay. There we go.
Big hiccup.
Hey. That's all right. I'm gonna bring this slide down and back up and see if we'll get it back on the screen. Oops. Oh shit. Can you throw it back in the queue?
Yeah, I'm trying. Okay, sorry about that. Big hiccup on my internet. Here we go. Okay, so did we where did I cut out for you?
I don't know. You were talking about Isaiah 53, the last.
Yeah, so Rogue One, the Star Wars thing, like the fact that Mark and the other gospel authors match Hebrew scripture prophecy, to me is just like it's such a nothing burger. Like, who cares?
Yeah,
they could read it, they could write whatever they wanted. Like, there's no controlling authority on what they were going to write. And certainly for Mark, right? Mark has nobody he has to satisfy except himself. But he's clearly using Isaiah as like more than a proof text. He's using it as a structure for his book. And again, there's a sort of a mini suffering servant narrative in the Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 2, that when you read that Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 2 section later in the text, it like clearly is using it as a source as well. So he's going to bridge Hebrew scriptures, cosmic theology, and the narrative, right? So there's a heavenly
you don't think
beloved.
He's reading from any Hebrew, right? You think he's reading?
No, he's all Greek. Yeah, he's
right.
reading the Greek.
I completely agree.
There's absolutely no evidence that any of the New Testament writers read the Hebrew, as far as I know.
Yeah.
So there's a heavenly beloved who descends through the cosmic levels in the vision of Isaiah. We talked about this already. He changes his clothes to hide his real nature from the lower rulers. And then in the vision of Isaiah text, he is humiliated and crucified. Whether that's actually on earth or whether it's actually in the lower heavens is not clear from the text as we have it now, because it's been heavily edited and heavily changed. And there's an added mini gospel that's much later that includes Joseph and Mary and the story that we already know from Mark and Matthew, but that is not in the earliest version of the story. And in that story, he goes back up to heaven to be at the right hand of like the God who's at the seventh layer. And what we see is that this is the Pauline understanding, right? Everything that Paul says about the Jesus figure can be interpreted in this light. Now, that doesn't mean that there wasn't a figure on earth who was also understood to be that person. But it does mean that the narrative understanding of Paul isn't necessarily interacting with a historical person that he identifies as Jesus of Nazareth. Paul never writes Jesus of Nazareth. He never talks about him being in Galilee. He never talks about him going to Jerusalem. All the story that we see in Mark is just absent in Paul.
Hey, can I get a timeline on you? Because you brought up the ascension of Isaiah. My understanding is that this is late first century.
It's late first century text, but again, I think
it's influencing the church big time.
With Gospel of Thomas and the vision of Isaiah, we just don't know. Like, there's no way to be sure. I think there's a reasonable case you can make that the Gospel of Thomas might even predate 70 CE.
Parts of it, I think some scholars think it is.
And just being rewritten or like baptized into the Jesus tradition with like later copies. We have later copies that don't necessarily track. And there's a shorter version of the Gospel of Thomas that I think has 17 sayings instead of the broader expanse that we found with the Nag Hammadi texts.
Yep,
so
that's the largest.
This is a tough timing thing for me. But what we can be confident of, I think, is that Mark is written after 70. And I think we can be pretty confident he's after Josephus writes the Jewish War. So I think 85 is a perfectly reasonable timeline there. So Mark identifies in the first chapter Jesus as this hoagapetos, and that's going to echo the term that's used both in the book of Isaiah, and this is the name of the character who descends to the lower layers to get crucified by the archons of this age in the vision of Isaiah. And the baptism is his identity disclosure. That's where this phrase is used. And this narrative links Jesus, I think, by using that term to this prior existing tradition of the beloved that I think likely comes from the vision of Isaiah. If we try to run the game where Mark comes first and the vision of Isaiah comes later, it just is weird, right? The vision of Isaiah being written after Mark doesn't answer a lot of the questions that someone who had read Mark would have about the vision of Isaiah. Whereas Mark being written after the vision of Isaiah is like the infancy gospel of Thomas, right? The infancy gospel of Thomas was trying to answer questions people had about Jesus's childhood. Mark is trying to answer questions people might have had about the vision of Isaiah from my reading.
I'm going to give you some pushback on that later.
Okay. Sounds good. So we've already talked about Paul not offering a full biography. Paul's Christ is descended. He dies in ignorance, and then he's later exalted and given the name that is above all other names. That's all very odd on the standard narrative story if Mark is written first and Paul is aware of it. Now, I have heard people argue the position that the narrative gospels already existed at the time that Paul is written, and Paul is seeing them as an instructive allegory and as a paideia text, and he simply doesn't give them any like actual historical or theological weight, so he simply doesn't refer to them. I don't know how you square that circle. Like, I don't have a way to decide between those two options, but I think they're both two live options. That I think the simpler is to assume that he wasn't familiar with the texts. All right. So this idea then is that Mark is taking Pauline theology and putting it into a narrative form that a new Christian student could understand. So Pauline theology is very difficult for beginners, according to Paul, right? He can't give the meat to the new beginners, the new Christians. They need milk, they need narrativization, repetition, and images. And so Mark's basically primary school for these new Pauline Christians on this view, right? And we can understand that if somebody wanted to understand how the Force and the midichlorians worked, we wouldn't give them an extensive tome on how the Force is like structurally constructed. We'd have them watch like the first 6 Star Wars movies, which would give them a good idea and a much like cleaner narrative understanding of it. So in Paul, Paul talks about it being mystery hidden for long ages. And in Mark, this is what we were talking about. Outsiders receive everything in stories. Mark 4:12 is very clear about this. In Mark, Jesus doesn't want outsiders to understand the truth. He wants only the insiders to get everything. And even though Jesus explains this to the disciples in the Gospel of Mark, they never get it. They never figure it out. They fail to understand. And this is very similar to Plato's story of the cave, right? The guy comes in from the outside, tries to explain it to all the people who are chained to the wall in Plato's cave, and they can't get it. And in fact, it upsets them, right? Whereas in Mark, we see what's called the messianic secret that Vrede put forward. Demons and non-ethnically Jewish or Israelite people in the Gospel of Mark frequently recognize exactly who and what Jesus is, right? Which would fit with the Pauline structure that the truth of the Christian religion is hidden from the Jewish people because they can't see through the veil of those scriptures until they get Christ, right? So this is just Mark using another Pauline metaphor. So the revelation there in Mark is like graded, it's selective, certain people can see it, and they're frequently outsiders, not insiders. So the transfiguration is like a very big event in Mark. It's the hinge point of the gospel. Prior to the transfiguration, most of the narrative is constructing Jesus as a Moses, Elijah, Elisha figure, right? He has narrative resonances with the story of Moses, with the story of Joshua to some degree, with the story of Elijah and the story of Elisha. And I won't give you all the parallels on all the various miracles. But very importantly, right before the transfiguration, the chapter before that in chapter 7, there's this dispute with the Pharisees about children who don't honor their fathers and mothers being able to give a sacrifice in the temple as a korban instead of having to honor their fathers and mothers. And I think that's very telling that the next scene is the transfiguration, which is a father respecting his child for being faithful to the father, right? And so, and what is the fundamental narrative of Mark? It's a sacrifice of an actual human being who's being killed, which is what he's arguing for in chapter 7. He's saying instead of allowing these people who are dishonoring their parents to give a sacrifice, you should be sticking to the Mosaic law if you weren't hypocrites, and you would have them stoned to death, right? That's like what the Mosaic calls for. So I think that like the idea that this is a historical narrative, to me, just like that doesn't fit. And it fits much more as a literary parallel and an obvious like foreshadowing that the author is doing. And then at the transfiguration, you see the law, which is the Torah, personified by Moses, and then the prophetic writings personified by Elijah. And then the heavenly voice identifies again Jesus as this beloved figure, which again is going back to that. And there's a position held by Willie Markson and then also now C.J. Cornthwaite that the Markan transfiguration may draw also on an earlier text that actually saw the transfiguration as the original like resurrection ascension narrative, or at least the original ascension narrative, where in the Apocalypse of Peter, there's a scene that mimics the transfiguration very closely. Moses and Elijah also appear. But at the end of that, rather than Jesus just getting really white clothes, he actually ascends up into the heavens. And that's the beginning of the apocalypse, where you the reader is transported into heaven, sees all the layers of heaven. So there's a good argument, I think, to be made that the transfiguration may originally have been the ascension of Jesus on this viewpoint. And Markson sees it as just a transposition to the middle of the story of what would have been normally at the end.
Let me throw something at you on that, just for a brief pause on this.
Sure.
My understanding of this and the dating on it, the best that I can tell, 1 Corinthians, somewhere in 1 Corinthians, maybe 13, I don't remember if it's that far along, but is the first time in the date wise that we see a resurrection being mentioned. Paul is actually the first one that uses the term resurrection.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think he uses it in saying inside of the same sentence that he was saw by the 500 and later by me.
Oh, you're talking about 1 Corinthians 15.
Okay, 15. But when he says this, he says that other people saw him and that at last that I saw him. But the way that it reads in the original Greek context, you can't distinguish that they saw him differently than how Paul saw him. So it seems to me that what could be going on here is Paul is saying that the 500 that saw Jesus resurrected saw him in the same way that Paul saw him, which we now see and
in the same way that Peter saw him, right?
Right. Peter was in the same sentence.
And
it was
Peter is always the first vision.
Himself.
Peter always is the first vision. And it's very important that Paul is writing according to the scriptures after almost all of these, right? According to the scriptures means I read it in a book. Like if I say I saw The Shining as a movie, then I'm saying I saw The Shining as a movie. But if I say I saw The Shining as according to the book The Shining, what I'm saying is I read the book. And then I got this understanding.
I don't think in this particular text, though, he says as it was written in the scriptures, though.
No, in 1 Corinthians 15, he says he first appeared to Cephas according to the scriptures.
Really? I'm going to have to look at that again.
Kata tas graphas. So again, if I say I saw something according to the scriptures, I think that means I read it in the book, and then I might have had like a later vision, or I might have had a dream about it, or any of it. But these people think dreams are messages from God. They don't think that dreams are just like dreams that happen to cause like brain housekeeping during REM. They don't have that understanding. They think dreams are actual communication with the world. So, and again, when you read the Apocalypse of Peter, it's not clear there's a clear understanding of the gospel narrative. It's a later text. I don't doubt that. But it may actually preserve an earlier conceptual understanding that might have been paired with the vision of Isaiah, where this is an ascent and judgment and revelatory pattern, rather than an actual attempt to tell a history.
Yeah.
Now, when we look at Mark's opening, what we don't see is an infancy narrative, any description of historical sources. Jesus just appears abruptly, and the heavens are torn open. The heavens tearing open is what we might expect if a figure had descended down the layers and then needed to come to earth. And again, we're fairly confident that Marcion's gospel that he put in the first New Testament was not Mark. It's not the Mark that we have today. There's too many separate witnesses who see it differently. But Marcion's gospel apparently began in the way that Mark begins, right? With Jesus just appearing at John the Baptist and getting baptized. So we don't know that they're the same text, but they did begin the same way. And this is with a spiritual
so
descent,
did Luke,
right?
though, Curt. The reason I wanted to give you some pushback on this is because Marcion's gospel is most similar to Luke than it is Mark.
Yeah, that's correct. Again, we can either say that Marcion mangled Luke and took out the infancy narrative and took out the prophecies and the angels and the shepherds and all that, or we can say that Luke is multiply authored and that the original version of Luke was Marcion. But if the original version of Luke started out the same way as Mark did, well, that means that Luke is following Mark and had the originally the same structure. Now there's James McGrath, who's come forward and tried to say that the early sections of Luke actually are later additions and that they're rewritings of traditions associated with John the Baptist originally. I think that's entirely possible. But that would mean that the Luke we have today with the prologue to Theophilus and the careful historian stuff and the census of Quirinius, that's all later addition. That's not something that was originally in Luke on that view, which means then we can't use any of that to like mark the genre of the books, right? So moving on. So obviously there's a lot more in Mark than I have time to get through. So I just want to deal here at the end with my particular reading of it. And so we're going to start with Bartimaeus. So Bartimaeus, first of all, the name means the son of Timaeus. And the Timaeus to Philo and to the Alexandrian Greeks was like the most important Platonic dialogue to get them to understand like the nature of the cosmos. And it just strikes me as almost impossible that Mark is not deliberately making a callback to the Timaeus by using this name. It's possible he's not, but if we read Dennis R. MacDonald's book on the Homeric epics and Mark, we have to understand that Mark is a careful writer who understands what he's doing. And when he makes a Homeric reference, he's doing it consciously. So I think if he's making a Platonic reference, he's also doing it consciously. And what's important is even while blind, because he is the son of this Greek dialogue, he can actually see that Jesus is the son of David right away, and he follows on the way. Now, as far as we can tell, that is the first term that was used to describe Christians, was they followed the way, tehodo. So in Greco-Roman philosophy at this time, there was this big idea. We see this in Seneca, we see it in Philodemus, we see it in a lot of different philosophers, that what you really wanted was to have this ideal observer who was going to watch you all your life and would like give you guidance through your life. And when you had that ideal observer watching you all the time, it would make you feel like more confident about your actions and make you constantly reflect on your actions. So where Bartimaeus is coming is he's like this guy who's dirty rags and he's blind, and Jesus heals his sight because the sight allows him to see Jesus and follow on the way. Now you can read the text yourself and you can come to your own conclusions about it. but I do think this is a very reasonable way of looking at it. And then what we see is that Bartimaeus then can become each successive neoniskos. So neoniskos just means young man, and he's not given a name in the other two sections. And again, you can see them as three different characters. I don't think it actually matters that much to this analysis, but from my reading, a careful author like Mark would just be describing them as the same person. So in stage 1, he's wearing these filthy rags. In stage 2, he's wearing a linen, what's called a sindon, which is the type of thing people would be put in a grave. And then in stage 3, he's wearing this white raiment that matches exactly the white raiment that Jesus gets at the end of the story of the Transfiguration. And importantly, when Jesus gets that white raiment in the Transfiguration, Elijah and Moses simply disappear, and Jesus just puts out this beam of light like Wanda in WandaVision, right? And the white raiment is how it's described as brighter than any fuller could make it white. Well, there's a famous resurrection narrative in Herodotus about a man named Aristeas who dies inhaling fumes in a fuller's shop. His body can't be found, and then he later shows up 3 years later and is considered to have been resurrected. So again, if Mark is a careful writer, he may very well just be making a reference to this with that fuller word. But if Bartimaeus is stage 1 and the Gethsemane youth is stage 2 and this tomb youth is stage 3, then this is a symbolic chain that shows what the young Christian will go through, the 3 stages, until he's able to understand the meat of the Christian philosophy. So stage 1 on this idea, and again, this is now like a later Valentinian understanding of these stages, but I think if you read Paul carefully, you can see Paul does include all 3 of these stages in his understanding as well. If you haven't read Elaine Pagel's book, The Gnostic Gospels, or not the Gnostic Gospels, the Gnostic Paul. The Gnostic Paul basically shows how the Valentinians had good sources for all their understandings from within the Pauline texts. And I think this is pretty clear. So in stage 1, Bartimaeus loses his dirty cloak, his outer cloak that's covered with mud, and he has this physical lack that gets healed by Jesus so that he can see. He throws off his cloak and he detaches from his old self and becomes a Christian following on the way. In stage 2, I had to work a little bit with the AI to make this SFW.
Oh, yeah.
But in stage 2 in Gethsemane, he's wearing this sindon, which is a grave type of linen garment. And after the scene in Gethsemane where the disciples are idiots and fall asleep and are useless to Jesus, this youth is caught and they try to seize him, and he runs out of his garment and flees in fear because he doesn't trust his nakedness. Now, not being comfortable with your nakedness is a definite callback to the story of Adam and Eve. But it also is a callback to Paul's understanding of the psychic man. The psychic man has gained like some knowledge, they've gained some understanding of the world, and it makes them afraid. So he runs away in fear at stage 2. And then in stage 3 now, he's in this white clothed transformed form. He's very calm. He is wondering why people would be afraid. And in my opinion, importantly, he is inside a tomb, which is a kind of cave. Okay. If we see the Timaeus as referring to Plato, and we see the allegory of the cave in Plato, it strikes me as any person who's familiar with those texts, who's reading in the 1st or 2nd century, a story of a person inside a cave who has an insight, who tells people outside the cave something and they run away in fear, is going to see that as a reverse mimesis, right? And Dennis R. MacDonald, I think, has just fully established that the author of Mark is definitely doing mimesis and frequently doing reverse mimesis. So in this stage, this Neoniskos is wearing the Jesus garment from the Transfiguration. He's clothed in this bright white, and he's the spiritual man now. He's the he's the fulfilled initiate. He can now understand the meat of Christianity. He can understand the truth of it. And yet, when he tells other people, they are afraid and they run away. Now, if 16:6 leads directly to 16:8 in the original version, and 16:7 is an inserted, like post-production move to try to harmonize with the other ascension and resurrection narratives with the physical body resurrection.
You're talking Mark 16:8 verse.
Yeah, it's added at the same
verse
time that the shorter long ending would have been added, which those are added relatively early, right? We know that
yes, the
reference to Salome that's in one of the endings is being referred to by the time of the diatessaron, for example, which is
it's
I think
the Baba one, Baba something Codex.
Tatian writes the diatessaron, I think, in 170. So, and he has a reference to Salome, which is only present in the one of the added endings of Mark. So, if we see 1428 and 16:7 on Markson's theory, that those are later additions, then what's really happening here is this is the final. The original author's final statement, which is look at this calm guy, and then these people who hear the truth, they run away in fear. And so you can become like an initiated Christian, understand the actual anthropology, and you'll learn how to read the Hebrew scriptures with this allegorical method, and you'll be one of the visionaries who understands the truth. And again, we talked earlier about Zechariah 3, but this understanding of Bartimaeus and the Neoniskoi would match the story of Joshua the high priest, who gets his filthy garments replaced with these festal robes in Zechariah 3. So I think I already talked about that enough. So this again is the idea that you go from milk to meat. This is present in Paul. We don't have to wonder if it's there. This is present in Plutarch when he describes how these allegorical texts would be used by these mystery religions. And when we read Apuleius's book, The Golden Ass, this is literally this kind of a text for people who are being initiated into the Isis mysteries. And what we know is that the Latin version of the Golden Ass that we have today from Apuleius does have an earlier Greek narrative that's approximately like 1/8 the length, that does describe an initiate into the Isis mysteries being turned into a donkey for a period of time and then being healed out of that by the goddess. And that shorter Greek version would be very similar to what we see in the Gospel of Mark. So the movement here in Mark is through these various scenes. I've made the claim, and I'll make it again here. There's nothing in the Gospel of Mark that you can tell me is there that doesn't have a literary referent. There is a literary reference for literally everything. And again, I think William Vreda's Messianic Secret only makes sense if you see Mark as being a narrative that sanctions the transfer of the custody of the Hebrew scriptures from the ethnic Samaritan and Israelite and Jewish people to the broader Greco-Roman world as a whole. The people who see Jesus clearly are actually people like Pilate, the centurion, the Syrophoenician women, the demons, and Bartimaeus. The people who are from Israel and are Jesus' disciples and his closest people don't understand what he's saying in a direct callback to Mark 4, which is basically then going to be read as someone who's not Jewish or not Israelite as, yeah, Jesus didn't really come for them. He came for people like me who can see the truth of this, as is shown in chapter 4.
Mark referring to that he has secrets to his own internal group.
The insiders can see it. The outsiders,
the outsiders can't. Yep.
So I think I've already made this point in this slide. That we have to look at the transfiguration and the final scene as linked scenes. One is the very middle of the text, one is at the very end of the text, and the very beginning of the text is this figure descending through the tear in the structure of the heavens. So I think this just gives us a clean through line to say that Mark is taking all these various narratives, the Homeric epics, Plato, the Hebrew scriptures, and probably many, many other sources that we simply don't know about anymore today, right? We're trying to reconstruct a thought world, and it's always going to be limited. And again, what I'm doing here, like, there's no proof of this. This is literary analysis. There's no way to privilege one reading of a text over another. It's really hard to make like a strong syllogistic proof argument here. I just think that when people read the text with this mindset, many of the things that don't make sense on other readings do make sense here, and that's the best you can hope for with a literary analysis. So, and again, if you see Mark as a teaching document, as an allegorical document that's opening the Hebrew scriptures up to the eyes of these Greco-Romans who've never seen them before, it really does fit what we see presented to us in the text. So in this way, we would view Mark as a drama of the Pauline theology and the story of the suffering servant in Isaiah. It's not a biography, but a literary, symbolic narrative through line. And it's the transfer of the custody and ethnicity to this broader group. Now, read Justin Martyr and tell me that that's not Justin Martyr's understanding. That is like literally what most of the second century apologists for Christianity are saying when they're writing these apologies, is that Jerusalem's destroyed, the temple's gone. These scriptures are wonderful. They need a broader audience. This is what we see in Theophilus. It's what we see in Tatian's apology, which weirdly Tatian writes an apology to Trajan about the truth of the Christian faith and never once mentions the gospel stories that he wrote the Diatessaron about. Well, to me, that means maybe Tatian doesn't think these are histories. Maybe Tatian sees these as being some other genre, right? That's certainly a live possibility. If someone would write in the second century an apology to the emperor about how wonderful Christianity was, and yet not mention anything about the historicity of the Gospels. That's very odd on that view. Whereas if we view it as a paideia, then it makes perfect sense, right? We wouldn't ever write to the president and say, as Superman once said, this or that. That would mark us as like not being serious people. So if it's understood that this type of narrative was commonly used for mystery religions to instruct people, that would be why we see this absence of the narrative coming very frequently in these second century apologetics. So Paul is the source of the theology. Mark takes the story of Isaiah and adapts it to Paul, and that gives you a new manual for the Christian faith. So, wow, my timing was not bad. I didn't even really practice this out very much, and I got right on time. So good.
I tried not to mess with you too much.
Well, we got it, right? So Mark is an initiation text. On my view, it's not a biography. That said, I don't count myself as a mythicist. And the reason I say that is because I do think there is a historical Jesus who was an apocalyptic prophet, who is the source historically for part of the character of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. And that specifically is the character of Jesus ben Ananias in the Jewish War, which like Theodore Whedon has shown that there's like at least 22 points of contact between the narrative of Jesus ben Ananias and the narrative of the trial in front of Pilate in the Gospel of Mark. And so if that's the case, then great. Like that might be the historical quote Jesus. But so what, right? We know that Howard Hughes is the historical Iron Man. If Howard Hughes is the historical Iron Man, all we could say is that Howard Hughes was the basis of Iron Man, but it doesn't mean that Howard Hughes was Iron Man. And we wouldn't actually necessarily want to talk about the historical Iron Man as Howard Hughes, even though we know that, right? So there can be an apocalyptic prophet who was the basis for the Gospels that was a real person. It doesn't matter. Richard Nixon was a real historical person, and The Watchman was written in the life of Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was alive when The Watchman was written, but the genre of The Watchman is not history. And we can't go to the genre of The Watchman and find something about Richard Nixon that's said there and say, oh, this is indisputably true about the historical Richard Nixon, even though we know he really existed, right?
I want to thank you for changing that up and not using Abraham Lincoln and the Vampire Slayer, okay?
Okay. Yeah, I try to find new stuff, right?
Yeah.
So Mark Mark on this reading is an initiation text, not a biography. That doesn't mean there isn't a figure behind it. It doesn't mean there is a figure behind it, to be flatly honest. I think there is, but there wouldn't need to be, right? And in my view, it's just a way to teach to the student how the beloved is descended from this figure who can't interact with dirty, filthy matter, that your dirty cloak would like mess it up and make you upset. So you got to put on the new raiment that allows you to ascend up, to be able to be near this wonderful being who has all this whiteness associated with him, right? So the Hebrew scriptures are now going to the broader Greco-Roman world. And through the garment sequence, the student mentally and conceptually can take on this new clothing of Christianity. Oh, by the way, Paul has a whole section on putting on the new garments of the new thought world that one inhabits. And I think in Colossians, there's like a reference to putting on the full armor of Christ.
There is. Yep.
So what Mark is taking is a post 70 complete loss of the Levitical system, complete loss of the reason for being of the Hebrew tradition, and he universalizes it. He makes it a new understanding for the Greco-Roman populace. And that is my last slide.
Fantastic. I'm gonna
At 101.
chat.
Hey, not bad.
Yeah, chat is open. I got you at 1 minute, so you didn't even have. I got you at under the 101, so you're right at 1 hour exactly.
Nice.
Chat is open. Link is pinned in there. Y'all welcome to come in. You're welcome to put questions on the board, and we're gonna tackle some questions while I'm waiting for some people to come in here. Though I did want to mention some of my pushback. So
Sure.
here's the little pushback that I got on it. I am okay with 70, maybe a little later than 70. The reason that I mentioned the 70, I think most critical scholars do think that it's most parsimonious that the writer of Mark would have knew about the fall of the temple. Though it has been suggested, even by many critical scholars, including Dan McClellan, that it's not totally out of the wheelhouse of reason, that this could have been slightly right before 70 when the writing was on the wall, so to speak, that this was going to be happening. That the rebellion, the Jewish rebellion, everything was so heavy that there was that amount of tension. It's not unheard of.
Right.
They might have knew that this was coming, but I
Except
think
that-
most
so-
critical
so-
scholars put it at 70.
So let me explain why I don't give much credence to that, although it actually doesn't hurt. It doesn't hurt my position actually that much to accept, even if you're saying it's written in 68 or 67. Like
I
that,
don't believe that, but
that wouldn't destroy my understanding here very much. But I think it's very unlikely. And the reason for that is this Mark just doesn't know the geography very well. He does a lot of weird things with the geography, which to me means that he's not somebody who's on the ground who would have that level of knowledge, right? Jesus ben Ananias, I think, is in 67. So it's possible like this guy was so important historically that everybody knew about him. And Mark might be learning about him from some non-Josephus tradition that Josephus is also mentioning. So I don't want to say like that's a certainty on my view, but I think it's highly likely that Mark is aware of Josephus, and if Mark is aware of Josephus, then he's in the 80s, probably. And I think again, Mark doesn't give us any reason to think that he's done on the ground reporting or that he's talked to anyone. He is
Sure.
It's all literary references.
Duck, what's happening, man?
Hey, Duck.
Hey, what's up? I just got done with Dance Dad stuff, so I did that this morning, and yeah, I got to catch about half of Curt's talk, and yeah, I mean, I'd love to have kind of a conversation, some philosophy, some stuff. You guys know I'm an atheist and a skeptic as well, and so yeah, if you guys want to do that, that would be fun for me for sure.
Sure. I think we're all that. We're just talking about Mark in terms of like its development. The other thing that I mentioned earlier that I said I wanted to give you some pushback on was the ascension of Isaiah and the way that you dated the ascension of Isaiah. And the reason that I say that one specifically is because while I can see not a single note of Trinitarian or dualistic ideals of God in Mark, you do see them in the ascension of Isaiah. And this is getting closer to first and second century, or I'm sorry, this is getting closer to second century, thinking. I think you see in Ascension of Isaiah chapter 9 or 11, where you see that they turn from God, and then they see the other embodiment of Jesus Christ. Is that like the Father and Jesus is there simultaneously?
Well,
and you don't get this in Mark.
No, it's
You don't get anything
unquestionably
like that.
subordinationist. Like I don't disagree with that, and it's I think it's drawing on the same tradition Margaret Barker talks about, the two powers in heaven. I certainly think that certainly in Jewish understanding of the universe at this time, there's the story of Enoch becoming the Metatron. And some people do think that the Metatron may have originally been this figure. On my view, Mark doesn't have to have had a specific bound variable in mind. He could have simply been using whatever was available to get this story of the psychic initiation through to this idea of the rebirth, that what is raised is not what is sown, that this new spiritual man could come from these sources within the scriptural tradition. And he may not have had a coherent theology. Like the idea that these authors knew what they were doing doesn't always track, right?
No, I understand.
The 20th century French literary critics said that authors frequently do things they're not even aware of. And I don't think that's impossible here either. So I think that Philo is very clearly, at least to some degree, aware of the idea of an angel of the Lord who is not the Lord and who is a power from the Lord. Justin is clearly talking about a secondary subordinate figure. So I think Mark can be understood within this framework with no difficulty. And I'm not certain that the actual vision of Isaiah, the descent and reascent narrative, that's like specially separate linguistically and conceptually from the rest of the ascension of Isaiah, was necessarily originally within that ascension of Isaiah framework, right? So
maybe not.
The vision of Isaiah is the central portion of that text. And if we take that by itself, I think it's very comfortable with a Justin-style subordinationist Christology. And again, I'm of the opinion that subordinationism, as we understand it as a heresy today, was the belief of all the church fathers until at least the beginning of the 4th century.
Thoughts on it, Doc? Where you at with Mark and its significance anyway?
Yeah, I would have two. So the two questions I would have, or if you consider them challenges, one is that versus a mythological or perhaps historically narrow reading, is that there is some case to be made that, there's some inference somewhere where we say, revealed religion is just like every other topic, right? And so if Mark is supposed to be contributing to this revealed religion thing where it is divine writing, but it's also about what humans understand, we should first make the case that that Mark himself wasn't somehow constrained. The product of this wasn't, you talk about Isaiah either because the prophecy is real, or if it's not practically real, it's like analogous or something. And then secondly, you place a character of Jesus places that a real Jesus would have been, but just like all other writing, some of it's grammatical, some of it's semantic. And so it's not actually sound to say, well, we have to put the semantics of the historical philology or something in there, because it's revealed religion, right? And so, basically I'm asking, do I have to start from scratch? Like, what's the most important things I should know or something?
So that's a great point, Duck. And I want you to get into the thought world of somebody who has some knowledge of the Hebrew scriptures, some knowledge of this group called Christians, or the way, or whatever we want to call it. But actually, if we see it as the way, that's even like deeper, right? If the way was the way the first Christians understood them, then the Bartimaeus narrative is very much marking Bartimaeus as the only character in the whole gospel who actually becomes converted, right? He's the only one who follows on the way. So the people who are reading this text the first time don't have any other text to tell them the story of Jesus. Like they just don't. So when they're reading it the first time, this is the first time they're coming across a character who's going to Galilee. And again, like in Mark, it's not at all clear that Jesus has a home in Nazareth or grew up in Nazareth. It's entirely possible that his home is in Capernaum from the way the book is written.
Just that he came out of Galilee.
Right. So nobody here has read Matthew who's reading this the first time. Nobody's read Luke. Nobody's read John. Nobody understands anything about the story as being present in the Pauline epistles. They're just reading it as a first pass. So then they wouldn't, I don't think they would necessarily conclude that this story was historically accurate. And I'll tell you why I think that's really actually marked out, right? If you're reading it in 80 or 90 and you're like reasonably well educated, you're going to know when John the Baptist died, right? And John the Baptist died in 36 CE. That's like very well established. Well, we know that Pilate leaves Jerusalem at the beginning of 36 CE, which wouldn't even overlap. There's no way to make that harmonize with the narrative that's being given in the Gospel of Mark, where John the Baptist's death precedes Jesus's death by a decent amount of time. Right? So if John the Baptist could die and Jesus can do all this stuff and then later get crucified by Pilate, to me, it's almost a marker that the author is telling anybody who's really educated, look, don't worry, this isn't like some historically true thing. In the same way that the guy who is writing The Watchmen is using Richard Nixon in ways that are clearly counterfactual so that you don't have to worry about reading The Watchmen and thinking this is going to tell me about Watergate. Right? Like I mean, it's not going to. He's marking to you that this is not a historical description.
So the one thing, the main thing I'd pull out is because the methodology is historical and because it was written on planet Earth, so it owes itself to things like geography, culture. It owes itself to the actual like a blockchain or whatever, the paper trail of how these people started writing about Jesus in the first place. But then it seems like it would also owe itself over to it would sound very odd if I told you that we're going to do a critical analysis of the metaphysics and epistemology of Mark, right? Maybe intuitively we think that's something that should be in there, and when we intuit further into it, or we intuit back and kind of ask where that type of question comes from, we would say, well, again, the whole spirit of revealed religion, it is not about the inference that one would wish to make about the physical things in the first place, but it is the inference one would make about the revelation itself. And so when we think about someone like Bartimaeus who was saved, or we think about John the Baptist's relationship or something with, John the Baptist's relationship with Jesus early in the book of Mark or something, it's like, well, this isn't because, I might say this isn't because these were celebrities, but it is because the larger truth was knowable. As maybe thuddy as that is, I would imagine there's a philosophical case to be made somewhere in there.
No, there's like my position, and again, this is not my like Christian origins explanation, but my position is that Eusebius is very clear that there were Christians before Christ, right? He identifies Philo as a Christian. He identifies the Therapeutai as Christians, and he certainly tries very hard not to alienate anybody who follows John the Baptist, which was a live religion today, right? There's still a religion on earth today that sees John the Baptist as a savior. So these traditions that we don't see described in the Bible at all, the Therapeutai and the Essenes, are very well described by other writers. And so when Eusebius says these people were like the early Christians,
that's a good point.
I think we can just take him at his word, right? That they were.
Yeah, it's a really strong point, I think, because when we're saying that, it's not just that there's a methodology, but the methodology isn't consistent, or seems to be different levels of access to the story. It's like that directly contradicts the notion of revealed religion. It's not just the inconsistencies produced, maybe, but it's like, well, those came from what seems like a human cause or something. I don't know. That's how I read or interpret that a little bit.
Well, let me interject something real quick. I want to interject something because there's something that when we talk about the relation between Paul and John a lot, it is not brought up, but the first one that mentions the resurrection, the first one that mentions Jesus in literature is Paul, and Paul in all confirmed books notably never mentions John the Baptist ever. He is never mentioned. And when we see external literature that winds up validating an individual that is John the Baptist, none of that same external literature validates an individual that is Jesus. And the only reason that I'm mentioning that is it's not, to me, very far-fetched that John the Baptist and Jesus in no external literature ever existed except in the book of Mark, that they coexisted at the same time. It could very well be that some legacy of this individual that is John the Baptist transitioned into by Mark saying, oh, they knew one another, and that they followed, that Mark was, or that Jesus was following John the Baptist's ministry, and he could have taken some of the clout of John the Baptist and ran with it. It's not impossible for me, just because
I think that is exactly.
It's not cloud. It's in revealed religion language. It's a relationship, right? It's like if you're not very smart and you can't see this relationship, there it is. There it is, right? Yeah. It is that someone who is already anointed by God is now doing the work of someone who, if you want to say they're being purified or transcending, that is what they are doing there then.
No, I think that's exactly the narrative we see. And if we track it out, like we know there's these Essenes and we know there's followers of John the Baptist before the destruction of the temple, right? We know that exists.
Yes.
They have these special meals. They have these baptism rituals. They have all this stuff that we now associate with Christianity. Well, what happens? The temple gets destroyed. Now, what are we going to do? Well, what we most would want to do is try to unite, if they're disparate strains, unite them into one strain, and then give them a structure whereby they can have a cognitive acceptance of that. Well, what a better way to do that than to say, oh yeah, there was this Jesus figure. And some people even thought he was John the Baptist resurrected. And by the way, John the Baptist actually is the reason he actually came down to earth, was to get baptized by John. And then, oh, by the way, he did all these special meals and he recommended baptism with the Spirit, not just with the water. So this just to me seems like a very clear through line. And then we have Philo's Logos, and we can see the similarities between Paul's Christ and Philo's Logos. Well, we don't have to wonder if people interpreted the story of Jesus as Jesus being the Logos. We have the Gospel of John. It just tells us right there, right? We have the whole set of Johannine epistles to tell us, yep, he was the Logos, absolutely. So what is it in this structure that tells me I have to think all these people are writing these careful histories? I just don't see it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the answer, right? Written careful histories, they're also not produced from a place that produces historicism that isn't really exegenic or exegesis or is supported someplace else. And so if you're not a historian like me, you're not a linguist, you're just looking at it, it's just a dumb fucking book, right?
Okay, I actually going to fully push back on that a little bit. I actually will say, in my opinion, this is my opinion, of course, there's no Academy Award for this. I think the Gospel of Mark is arguably the most influential text written in the entire Western tradition. Yeah. I think it's the single most important book that anybody ever wrote. And I say that as a heavy critic of the results of the book, and I'm not a Christian and I don't accept it. I think it's wrong on many, many key points. But in terms of influence and understanding, once we accept that all the other three Gospels are drawing on the Markan narrative and the scope and impact of the total four Gospel story on Western civilization, there's not a more important text. And I think it's an incredibly well-written, incredibly well-crafted, well-designed, conscious literary. I think it's a great story, right? It's been called the greatest story ever told. And Mark's Jesus doesn't have the Mary Sue problems that the later Jesus has. Mark's Jesus is kind of a dick sometimes. Mark's Jesus has suffering and real conflict, unlike the other Jesuses.
Let's get a response, and then let's try to do some of the Q&A answers, and then we'll go ahead, Doug.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's not like Cosmo or something, right? The Gospel Mark was written to be about a holy text people lived their lives by and basically recreated aspects of bureaucracy in a new society. And so if you're saying, well, you're already recreating a society, that would um, undermine the fact that that it's the most important text because first, it only inspires.
Duck, I'm gonna be gone for a
those-
second. I'm still listening to you, but I got to pick up a delivery. I'll be on the headphones, but I won't be able to talk.
Alright, I'm just gonna drop off. That's all I had. I'm gonna leave.
Oh well, then I guess
That's all right. I can cover dead air. Don't worry about it. Kurt.
Give me a couple of minutes. I just got to get the delivery. I'll be right back.
Ducks, thanks for stopping in, man. But yeah, so there's a few things that I wanted to mention on the book of Mark to start with. The book of Mark, whenever, and you know what? In fact, I'm fixing to pull it up here because I wanted to get some of the introduction, some of the intro verses and what we've had that has slowly drifted from the original text or the oldest text that we can find. It's difficult to even say the original text, but let me see if I can get this on the screen here. Here we go. Whoop. And let me see, maybe I need to just zoom in on there. This is pulling from, I'm using the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition. And it is as far as free versions go, it's going to be the best that you can get as far as the translation of it. Starting in verse 1, I wanted you to notice some of the things that you'll see different inside of your KJVs. In your very first verse where it says the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, you'll see in your KJVs or any of your later versions will say the Son of God after that. And the reason that this doesn't read that way is because in your oldest three texts, in fact, the Codex Sinaiticus, the Codex Vaticanus, and the Codex Alexandria, the oldest text that we can find of the book of Mark that has this section, they actually don't have what your modern versions will have, the Son of God. It's not inside of the first verse. So when we get the New International Revised Standard Version Updated Edition that tries to go back to more of the source text, we'll get a lot of these little bitty add-ons like the Son of God and other little comments that are removed from them because they're not found inside of the oldest text. And you'll see this in a lot of different verses. And another one is, and I'll have to find exactly where the verse is on it, but you'll find this also in the verse about the eating with tax collectors. I think most of your later works after 350, 340, you'll get a lot of those codexes will say that he ate and drank with sinners and tax collectors, but the oldest two versions, the Codex Vaticanus and the Sinaiticus, say that he ate with, he doesn't say drink. So when you read that text in the New International Version New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition, you'll see that it doesn't say drinking with. That it just says eating with. So there's lots of like little things that slowly but surely, these are interpolations that wind up getting added into Mark as the years went by. But when we go back to the oldest text, I think we're dating around 325, 324. They don't have a lot of these. In fact, we get some verses that are even now red lettered in Mark that get added in there. I think one of them was about forgiveness. Curt, I don't know if you're back yet.
Yeah, I'm back. There's a whole section in Willie Markson's book on the Gospel of Mark where he talks about changes to the text that would have happened before Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. And he's pretty convinced that these things did happen. And he specifically highlights the one you're talking about, and also some of the sections in verses 10 through 15. That he thinks might have been added later. So I think
Mark 11,
again, there's not a good way to know at this point, right? We only have the textual tradition of what we can do as literary analysis. And like, there's never going to be like a slam dunk unless we happen to, like, the dream would be we find a version of the Gospel of Mark from the Villa of the Papyri in Herculaneum, right?
Sure.
And it's dated as 67, and then we can be like, oh, see, right? But then we would be able to tell like what's different between this version and ours. It's not going to happen. But Like that's like the only way we could answer some of these questions is to get an actual first century document. Well, the fact is, as far as textual tradition, as far as archaeology, as far as like being able to identify this thing here that we have a physical copy of is certainly Christian, there's nothing from the first century. There is zero.
But we do have enough to know that a lot of interpolation, a lot of little add-ons happened because we do have old enough texts to now know that we have some of the oldest, and it's never like the older stuff. The further we go back, oh, there's stuff here that is here, but it's not in the later ones. No, what we have instead is stuff is in the later ones, but it's nowhere in the earlier ones, and we get that consistently. And this is one of the verses that I was wanting to mention. This is in Mark 11. And this was a big one because though this is not red letter here, this was supposedly the words of Jesus here that just got added in here. And this is in the book of Mark. This is not like John's old addition. So this one says in verse 25, and when you stand praying, forgive if ye have all, I hate this damn KJV. Some people are going to have problems with the language on this. If ye have aught against any, that your Father also, which is in heaven, may forgive your trespasses. And then the next verse, verse 26, is a verse that is not in any of the three oldest texts that we have, which is the Vaticanus, the Codex Sinaiticus, or the Codex Alexandria. This verse is not in there at all. But if ye do not forgive, neither will your Father in heaven forgive your trespasses. And this is attributed to Jesus Christ saying this, and it's not in any of the oldest texts. So it just totally got put in there.
Yep, absolutely. So the thing I would just point out is that in terms of the structure of Mark, like we don't have to wonder about that. That's preserved. And in terms of like the latest possible date, I think it has to come before Justin Martyr, because even though Justin doesn't describe Mark separately or give it an authorial name, he does have the quote where John is renamed Boanerges, and Mark is the only gospel source of that. So we know Justin is aware of something that has some similarity to our version of Mark.
Yeah, well, we get something weird also with Mark, and Luke does it too. I say it's weird. It's only weird because in contrast with Matthew, and that is Matthew's name specifically. That if you read Matthew 9:9, it identifies the tax collector that he says, "Hey, to come and go with me." It identifies him as Matthew. Whereas both Mark and Luke, and Mark we know is the oldest text on this, he identifies the individual as Levi. Right. And he says the tax collector Levi to come with me, which what is weird about it is Mark also mentions Levi as being the son of a gentleman. Hold on. I actually had this written down earlier, but that later, I think Mark 11 says that James is the son of this gentleman, but Mark is mentioned in the same context, and he's not mentioned as the son of Alphaeus. So it's in Mark 2
James, 4. Son of
Alphaeus, right. But you get this in Mark where he says James, the son of Alphaeus. But whenever Mark first says Levi, he says Levi is the son of Alphaeus. But when he mentions Matthew, he doesn't say, he mentions Matthew along with James, right? When he's calling out all of the followers, he's calling out the 12 apostles, but he doesn't say, he says that James is the son of Alphaeus, but he doesn't say that Matthew is, right? That he's the son, which is a weird thing, because if Levi is Matthew, then why would you not put the two brothers together and saying that they are the son of?
Again, there's been the apostolic literature is full of so many harmonizing like rereads or different ways of reading it, and like it's so funny because like Origen is like adamant that James was not the brother of Jesus. Like they couldn't be brothers in any way because Mary remained a perpetual virgin, and there's no chance that she could have had any other kids. So James couldn't be the brother of Jesus. But then you'll hear like modern people saying, well, James was clearly the brother of Jesus. Well, really? Because Origen seems to be very adamant that he was not.
But he was all in on the proto-evangelium at the time, which, I mean, that was big. And the church, I'm not saying the church fully accepted that as canon at the time. But that was kind of the orthodoxy was still coming into its own, and the proto-evangelium. I mean, it was the bee's knees.
Yeah, and again, if you look at all the second century like expandatory gospels and things like the Epistle of Barnabas and stuff like that, there's like this clear move to try to get this custody transfer of the Hebrew scriptures over to these Greco-Romans as cleanly and clearly as possible. That like the original custodians of these texts didn't handle them correctly. The idea that like the Jewish people killed all their prophets and destroyed them all. Like this is just this is the milk that these second century people are living within.
Sure.
And so they don't want Mark to be the first gospel people interact with. That's why they put Matthew first, in my opinion.
Absolutely.
Because if Mark is the first gospel people interact with, if Mark is the first gospel people interact with, they're like, what the heck is going on in this text? It doesn't seem like a straight history. And so they're going to like really question the narrative. But if you read Mark after you've read Matthew, then you're just like, oh yeah, well, this is the same story. And he's just telling it a little differently.
Sure. Let's try to do some of these questions. If y'all have any questions, please put them in chat. If y'all want to come in, chat should be it should be pinned. Y'all are welcome to come on in. But if you got questions, Curt, we got one here from Scott. And I think he was out washing his car or something, but he put it on his phone. So Curt, have you run across any Christians that accept an approach similar to yours? If so, how do you describe spiritual inspiration or scriptural inspiration?
There are no Christians on earth who want me to speak for them, as far as I can tell. So I certainly will not be speaking for any Christians. But like the specific understanding of what the author is doing with Bartimaeus, I do have a brother who has like a graduate degree in theology and taught theological classes, mostly works as a historian. But he actually thought it was a productive way of viewing Mark. And even though he's a Christian, he saw it as like potentially what a set of ideas the author was trying to get across, which again, to me, like means that has some legs. If somebody who comes from a completely different paradigm from what I'm coming from sees this literary reading and goes, oh yeah, I can see how that would make sense. So Christianity is absolutely able to incorporate any new finding of any type, no matter how destabilizing it might appear to be to some members of the faith. Like there's just nothing that Christianity hasn't been able to absorb. And if it turned out that we found conclusive proof that Jesus was never raised from the dead, Christianity would go on undisturbed, I have no doubt, because the source of Christianity isn't the doctrines or the belief system or any of that. It's the affinity fixation for the tradition. And so people will just find a way to reinterpret the tradition like they've done forever. And I don't think it really is not a situation where you're going to like show people something from the Gospels and they're going to be like, damn, Christianity is all wrong.
Yeah.
You just have to come to that on your own.
That reminds me of a question that I was asked about the 2,000 year period before Christ coming back, and that he was supposed to be, he would return before this generation passed. I was asked, how many generations do you think that it'll take, or how much time do you think it'll take before Christians realize he's not coming back? And the answer to that question is there's no amount of time. There is no amount of time. We could go another 2,000 years and they'll still be, he's coming back. So it's not as if
100,000 years.
Right. 100,000 years. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. They're still going to be holding their breath for that. So we got a question coming in from Azo here. What are the winning lottery numbers? Okay. All right. I don't know that we have the answer to that question, Azo.
12, 17, 63, 8, 15, and 33. There you go.
You heard it here. If that hits something, y'all all messed up by not banking on Curt here. If y'all got any questions,
don't spend your money on the lottery, please.
No, go all in on it. Go all in on it. Y'all heard it from Curt. Any more questions? Put them in the side chat here. Meanwhile, while we're waiting on anything, is there anything that you think you lightly covered or would want to go back and touch on?
Just to be very clear on the Eusebian thing. So Eusebius does highlight that they're putai. They live on Lake Rhocotis. in Alexandria. And oh, by the way, they're Christians. And oh, by the way, what they do is they reinterpret the Hebrew scriptures in these tales that they tell that are allegories. That's very interesting. And they were Christians, and they like clearly are mentioned by Philo, who makes no mention of Jesus. So, and Eusebius is saying they're Christians. Well, wait a minute. What relationship would they have with the Gospel of Mark? Well, guess where Eusebius says the Gospel of Mark was written? Eusebius says the Gospel of Mark was written in Alexandria. Oh, weird. That's where Philo and the Therapeutai were. And Philo interprets the Hebrew scriptures, the whole Exodus, all of that. That's all an allegory. It didn't really happen. Philo is saying it's like the destruction of sin in the life of people. And we shouldn't think that the Amalekites were actually murdered and killed and destroyed fully. No, that's just the nation of Israel, the Logos, like dealing with sin on earth. And we don't have to see it as having really taken place. And so when Eusebius is like saying these people were Christians and they generated some of the first Christian documents, and he puts Mark in Alexandria, I know that he's not saying this because that's not what Eusebius wants to say, but Eusebius endorses like the idea in Plato's Republic. He does do this in one of his ecclesiastical histories, that sometimes it's important to give people things that may seem misleading to bring them to the truth. And Plato endorses that as well. So, and we know from Eusebius' description of like Constantine's battle against Maxentius that he is not careful. He does not like tell stories as they really happen. He tells them in a way that's going to promote the faith. Because Lactantius was also a Christian, and Lactantius tells the story of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge between Constantine and Maxentius in a way that is just, Constantine had a dream and he told his soldiers to put a high row on their shields and they were victorious. That's all that happens for Lactantius. For Eusebius, the heavens opened and the hero was seen visibly by all the soldiers on the battlefield as a sign that Constantine would win the victory. So we already know Eusebius is not careful.
Yeah, and what I was mentioning earlier, when you said the way, I think those that follow the way or those following the way or something like this might have been the oldest text that we see. But to be clear, when we're talking about Paul's authentic documents or those that are non-contested, Paul has openings in some that he says to the church of Ecclesia, and to some he says to those called to be saints. To some, he uses these different openings all the time. So not only do we get the assembly, we get terms like the body of Christ, the followers of the way, we get the fellowship, the Christians, the bridge of Christ. And then I think the tower of Christ is probably the later kind of comparative, that the group or the collective is the tower. You know what I'm talking about, the Absolutely. White Tower and all in that. Yeah.
So the question is, did any Christians in the first century write these types of allegorical tales that we know of besides the Gospel of Mark? And yes, absolutely they did. So we have the Shepherd of Hermas. The Shepherd of Hermas is absolutely a non-historical text. Like there's nobody who thinks the Shepherd of Hermas is describing a real set of events in history. And oh, by the way, what is the Shepherd of Hermas trying to illustrate? It's trying to illustrate an important point of Pauline theology, right? That the new church, the new temple, the new action of God on earth is going to be this metaphorical tower that's built up of individual stones. Oh, and guess what? In Mark, Jesus is the cornerstone of the new building, right? And the word tecton, which we uniformly understand as having been a reference to carpentry, actually just meant craftsman. And if you read the Gospel of Mark with the word tecton being understood as stonemason, it makes much more sense than it does if you understand it as being read as carpenter, because Jesus is talking about stonemasonry often and all the time, whereas he never talks about carpentry per se, except to the degree that he has to carry a cross.
Yeah, carpentry is a bad translation of the thing. I think that's widely established. I don't know that any scholar would argue that that's a bad translation, a carpenter. It's more of a handyman, and it could easily be a stonemason.
Which just destroys Meet the Parents, because Owen Wilson's character says, yeah, so is J.C. Carpenter. And he's just correctly. exactly.
So we have, I guess, a Christian with given some contestation in the text here, I do believe, or in the conversation. I'm not sure how to say this. Orion CT, if you have anything that you'd like to enlighten us on, please, by all means, it is pinned. You're welcome to stop in. I think his comment on here was, wow, you 11 are slow. A link proof to Christians invented atheism. Okay.
Anti-Semitism.
Oh, anti-Semitism. I'm sorry. I read that. I read that too quickly. Were you aware of this? Christians invented
I don't know what the person is saying, and I certainly don't want to
address.
Well, no, I do think that you can't read the Christian texts like the Epistle of Barnabas or Shepherd of Hermas or any of the earliest Christian texts after the Pauline epistles and not see that even when we read the Pauline epistles, it's clear that they're talking about a supersession of the understanding of the Hebrew scriptures to a new group, right? Paul is talking about being the missionary to the Gentiles, the missionary to the uncircumcised. So obviously Paul is spreading the truth of the Hebrew scriptures to a non-circumcised, non-ethnically Israelite group. I don't think that's even arguable. And I've read the Gospel of John, and I'm certainly not going to say that it would be understood by any second century or first century reader if it was that early as pro-Jewish. Like you just can't see that. So I'm not claiming that I know the mind of the author. And I don't think that certainly he says Peter is Satan. He certainly doesn't like Peter. He doesn't like the disciples. He thinks they're idiots. They work in the text of Mark in a very similar way to a kind of play that was being written in Athens in the classical period called New Comedy, which Menander was one of the major writers of the New Comedy, and Paul specifically quotes him in one of the epistles. But another of the authors of the New Comedy was Philemon of Athens. And in these plays, there would frequently be a leader, an intelligent leader who's a wonderful guy, and everybody who's watching the play thinks he's great, but all the people around him are complete buffoons and idiots who don't understand anything that he's doing and can't figure out what he's trying to explain to people. So this is a fairly common literary trope in this period, as are empty tombs, right? Richard C. Miller and other authors recently have done a whole lot on resurrections and empty tombs. And when we look at the second century novels from the Greco-Roman period that we have, I think we have 6 of them. And in 4 of them, an empty tomb or a person who's thought to be dead and buried, but isn't actually dead is a major theme. But we don't even have to wait that long. Like the story of Romulus, with him being entombed and then his body not being found, and then him appearing to 2 friends who are walking down a road and having a conversation with them, and then they suddenly realize that it was Romulus. Long predates the Christian narrative, right? And people saw Augustus go to heaven after he died. People saw Julius Caesar go to heaven after he died. And Seneca writes a hilarious satire of Claudius that's called the pumpkinification of Claudius, where he talks about Claudius going up to the heavens after he dies and everybody being really weirded out by this really weird figure who's showing up in heaven. So it's not at all unusual to have a person who's coded in one of the texts of this era as a holy figure end up having their body disappear, and then that being considered evidence that they went up to heaven. It doesn't imply in any way that they were uniquely divine or the creator of the universe or anything like that. But I do think that Christians did come to that conclusion because they identified the Christ figure with the Logos, and that's what Philo says is a characteristic of the Logos.
What do you think about Dade's question here? I think this was in Mark to start with. This is from Matthew. He's writing it, but I think we have something similar to the love your neighbor. I haven't looked it up to see if there's an ish in the neighbor. And the reason that I say that is because when you see words that say a man and an ish, it specifically means, and you get this with women, you get these with a bunch of different noun words, that if they have the ish on it, it means specifically a Hebrew or an
Right.
Israelite.
Well, but this would have been in the Greek. Matthew
It
and
would have
Mark
been. Yeah, you're
both
right. You're
only
right. It
writing
would have been in the Greek. So I don't know myself the answer to this question. But I mean, I think Mark had a very similar verse to this one, I think in the lower 11, 12, somewhere in there.
Well, but in Greek, we have to remember that like Greek doesn't have one word for our English word love. It splits it up into three, right? So we can be pretty confident that Jesus isn't using erotic love for your neighbor.
Sure.
So probably it's either going to be filial love or like universal charity towards all people, like the agape love. And I'm not sure if Matthew 25 is using philos or agape for that particular passage. But if it's philos, then it's going to be narrowed to like those who are close to you in social structure.
Mark uses it in 12 and 31. He says the second is you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. It goes through a list of them. So yeah, Mark first uses this. So I think Matthew's not coming up with this authentically. I do think that this originated from Mark, and maybe it's adding a little on to it, but it seems to come from Mark 12 and 31.
Let me just see if I can. I'm just going to check to see if I can figure out which Greek it is.
Okay, yeah. But while we wait on that, we're going to put another question on the board here. Question: why does everyone in Mark misunderstand Jesus right up until the point that he his apparent failure? Again, this is Mark. This is being written a lot later, so I don't. You know, the writer could have put this as if, from the very beginning, from the very onset, that everyone knew that he was coming. And you know, there's some verses that suggest that the writer knows, obviously that the writer knows, and that everyone, that it is said that he's fixing to pay this great sacrifice. And he gives this reference, this ideal to the suffering servant. Mark already lays down this kind of idea, it seems. But as to the people that are around him, the narrative in the story is that they don't understand any of this until Jesus says, you know, that in this hour you're going to betray me, and this, that, and the other. And then Peter is like, wow, what are you talking about? I would never do that. So did you find anything?
So which Mark text are we talking about?
Originally, we're talking about Mark 12 and 31. He mentioned it out of Matthew, though. But if I had to guess, I mean, obviously, I think sometimes Matthew comes up with things authentically that are not associated to Mark. But this is one of the large percentages that are copied from Mark, the concept of. So the original would have been Mark 12.
So it's definitely agape.
Okay.
You said it's 32. It's kai a pen auto o. Wait, no, that's not. It's 33 you're talking about. Kaito agapan auton.
Yeah. Well, that's talking about to love God, and but I think let's see, 31. The second is to
31 is agapeseis. So yeah, it's just going to be another form of agape. So it's agape love, universalized love. And then Yuji, I don't know if you're familiar with Vreda's idea of the messianic secret in Mark, but he finds it confusing. Like, why is Jesus hiding his messianic nature? And I think the solution to that is that you realize all the people who don't understand him are ethnically Israelite. They're coming from within the tradition that values the Hebrew scriptures, whereas the demons and the Syrophoenician women and the centurions all see Jesus clearly, as does Bartimaeus. And Bartimaeus is the one who's like the most obvious because he's able to see who Jesus is, even though he's blind. Also, back to that. Mark on the 4. Transfiguration, one other like minor point that I didn't bring up is like, how do the disciples know that it's Moses and Elijah? Like, Israel religion was aniconic, so they wouldn't have known who these people were at all unless either Jesus explained it to them off camera or like God beamed the truth of it into their head, which I've always found like kind of humorous.
Hizzle,
like, how
are you
does
by
Paul
chance
know that it
posting
was
that
Jesus?
because it's not coming up in the pinned, Hizzle? Is that why you're pinning that? Or I pinned it, but was why you put it up there. If it's not coming up in the original, I apologize. I think that's a pinned link for that Hizzle put up there. Robin, how's it going?
Yeah, that was for me.
Okay.
Yeah, I couldn't find it. I don't know. That doesn't mean it wasn't there. Actually,
It was pinned. I don't know. I don't know what's going on with that anymore.
All right.
How's it been?
Good. I don't know much about all this. I had a question I typed in chat earlier. I just asked Curt if he's always been an overachiever.
Had to have been.
It seems like he knows shit about everything.
I don't see myself as an overachiever.
Yeah, you'd
but
have a degree if you did.
Yeah.
Even if people, like my grandma was like really adamant, I am just so worried you'll be arrogant when you grow up. So I've always tried to remember that and not be arrogant. But you can talk to plenty of theists who will say I am arrogant. So.
Well, I mean, overachievers can be arrogant. That doesn't.
Yep.
That isn't like a mutually exclusive trait. I don't think you're arrogant.
Thank you.
Got another question on here from UG.
If you remove the messianic secret from Mark, would the narrative still work, or is that tension doing a lot of the heavy lifting? I think it's a fundamentally different text if you remove that. Again, you lose the idiocy of the disciples. Mark 4 makes no sense without the messianic secret, right? Like Mark basically tells you why there's a messianic secret in chapter 4. So no, I think it's an important part of the text as we have it. And it's very interesting that Matthew removes it completely, Luke removes it completely, John literally has the exact opposite, right? John is like, no, man, I'm the Christ. Check me out. Here I am, Son of God, taking you to heaven. Like all that's fully in John and completely absent in Mark. So yeah, legendary development for sure.
Yeah, there's a step down they do. And I was mentioning this, I think just yesterday, I was chatting with somebody that they seem to step down the importance of John the Baptist. Mark seems to be the most important. And then Matthew and Luke step them down, whereas John doesn't mention John the Baptist at all. And it seems as if that maybe John the Baptist was taking up too much clout or so what, and he was being praised too much. So they kind of downplayed him as the gospel's developed with the last gospel, barely mentioning him at all. But Mark seems to speak of him the most.
Yeah, Mark says that there's no greater human being ever born of a woman.
Ever born of a woman. Yep.
And so, like, to me, again, that implies that Jesus himself is either not greater than John or he's not born of a woman, which might mean that even though he's familiar with the epistles, he does not have a section that says born of a woman in the epistles he knows about.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't think that whether it's the rip in heaven or whether Mark thinks of, maybe there's some older text, maybe some older tradition. Maybe Mark didn't want to wade into it because it was too unconfirmed inside of the vocal, storytelling, that he didn't want to wade into the water of where Jesus originated from at the time. Dade has a question.
He didn't want to go get baptized in that water.
Well, there's another one that, Mark does Born of the Spirit, and he doesn't do fire in the original ones. And then later you get some versions where it says that he that comes after me will baptize you in the Spirit and with fire. But like, that's not in the oldest text. And this is one that KJV actually gets right. It doesn't follow the textual traditions of translating because that come from Matthew. Like Matthew says he'll baptize you with the Spirit and with fire.
Mm-hmm.
Mark never actually said that in any of the older texts, but then in some of the later codexes, they wind up taking that from Matthew and they try to harmonize. Right. But
just like the short and the long ending are obvious harmonizing. And that's where Markson says, like, look at 14:28 and 16:7 as well. They may very well be harmonizing.
Yeah.
I'm gonna jump off here, but before we leave, check out the Ancient Churchianity's comment about spontaneous remission. Since Curt's a doctor, he can probably address that comment.
I mean,
Thank you.
there's spontaneous remission from many, many medical conditions, and we don't always have an exact explanation for it, but it usually involves an immune system that determines a way to fix a problem that previously it didn't, or stops doing something that it was previously doing that was causing harm. And that's immune systems do have like self-correcting mechanisms. But again, like there's no way to either prove or disprove divine action. Like we simply can't use it as part of our explanatory matrix.
Yeah, only that these things happen with or without religiosity in different people. You know, so it seems that it doesn't seem to be playing a part how religious or unreligious you are as far as its frequency. We'll tackle Dade's question here, though. Do you know anything about this woman in Isaiah 7:14? I'm not familiar.
I think it's the woman who is going to give birth to Emmanuel. So that's one of the prophecy texts that people will point to say Jesus was the Messiah. But it just doesn't say anything about the Messiah to me. And I think it's, again, the description, and you can see this like from many different people. It's a description of an event that's taking place at the time of the wars over the northern kingdom with Assyria. And it's an attempt to reassure King Ahaz that his government will not fall, even though the Israelite government might fall.
Do you know if this was the one where the Emmanuels was pluralized in the Hebrew? Yeah.
I don't know if it's plural or not, but it's they shall call him Emmanuel, which is mentioned in Matthew as like something that he's calling back to. But Matthew never bothers to actually have anyone ever call Jesus Emmanuel, which I find very odd. Yeah. But in Hebrew, Emmanuel supposedly means God is with us. So it might simply be a reference to him being the Son of God, like, or even the angel of the Lord, which, you know, I don't know if you've read Margaret Barker on that. And there's a lot of people who don't take her seriously. But if you see her as like describing something that's really in the Hebrew scriptures, then that would just track to being the figure that Philo is talking about.
Yeah. We got a few more questions on here. We're fixing to be wrapping up in about 5 or 10 minutes. If y'all got any more questions, we'll try to tackle them as we can. I wanted to mention to y'all that next Saturday is going to be complete open. Not Saturday, I'm sorry. We are now moved to Sundays. We're done with Saturdays. We're going to be on Sundays, and we're moving it to 3 o'clock.
We are like the early church. We're moving our holy day from the seventh day to the first day.
Yes. Yeah, you're a former 7-day Adventist, weren't you?
I was.
Yes, he immediately noticed this is blasphemy. He's like, he's moving from Saturday to Sunday. You know what he's doing here?
You're just like Constantine the Great.
Well, there's not as many things open on Sunday, so I figure if I'm going to spend one of my weekend days doing this, I'd rather it be me have Saturday open.
So you're like the JWs. You don't think there's anything sacred about Sunday. It's just a convenient day. But we're not supposed to worship any holy days or Sabbaths, right?
Yeah. Question here. If ambiguity is the core mechanism, is Mark deliberately preventing a fixed interpretation rather than guiding us to one? Is Mark trying to clarify Jesus is or is to control understanding?
Well, again, I don't know that the author of Mark thinks there's a Jesus to know.
Yeah.
I think he thinks there's a spiritual truth to know. And I think he thinks there's maybe a Christ or maybe a Logos that we can know. But if we take it as a paideia narrative, like Lucius in The Golden Ass interacts with all kinds of things that have like historical, veridical characteristics, but that doesn't mean that they really happened in the mind of the author. And I think that's the way to view it. And again, in the Shepherd of Hermas, like there's stuff that happens in the Shepherd of Hermas that you could say, oh yeah, that could totally happen. That's totally good verisimilitude. But it's clear the author of the Shepherd of Hermas is not describing anything historical. And I just don't think you can be confident that even though Mark includes characters who have historicity, that he was meaning it to be historical.
I don't know on that one. The thing is, there's just no good way to know. He does start the character out of the middle of nowhere, which is odd. It is obviously odd.
Absolutely. And like I've said, this is a literary analysis. This is going to ring true to people who are reading through the text with this understanding, or it's not. It's beyond proof. You can't prove it. You can just show resonances. And what we know from like general literary theory is, like, have you seen the number of people's takes on The Shining, the movie, and what Kubrick was trying to do and what he meant? And they all, like, when you're watching them, you're like, oh, wow, I can kind of see that, right? But then you'll watch another one, you're like, oh, maybe it's that, right? There's just no good way to know.
Well, in this case, you can get, well, not anymore, but you could have got Kubrick to talk on the subject early on.
He never did.
Never did. Yep. But I thank everybody for stopping by. Any last words, anything you got going on, Curt?
I don't have anything on my time horizon at the moment, except I'm doing my Substack series on how medicine disproves presuppositionalism. Yeah.
Well, that sounds great. Well, the Saturday after, we're going to have this open chat show. Then we're going to have, I'm trying to get Mark Reed on here. I've been talking to Mark Reed. Well, I'll have to do one early in the morning or something to try to get Mark on here. Our times are just so unbelievably different. But I'm fixing to have Mike from Answers and Atheists on. JL, if you're still hanging around, man, I'd love to have you on sometime to talk about a subject.
I did a stream with Mike yesterday on epistemology. So if anybody wants to.
I knew one was going on, but I was over in Mississippi. We were flea market selling and everything else, man.
Beautiful.
We were spending some money yesterday, let me tell you. We're blowing
Jackson,
it all.
or?
No, I was in Tylertown. They had a big flea market there in Tylertown, so I stopped in there. But we were all over. I was at a yard sale thing that they have that's a citywide yard sale earlier that day. So the whole day was spent just shopping flea markets and yard selling. But
very cool.
Yep. Well, I appreciate everybody for stopping by, and we'll see you next Sunday, 3 p.m. Central Standard Time.